The night they set fire to her cabin, Ada Crane stood at the tree line with a wool blanket around her shoulders and watched it go. The fire was not small. It climbed the shake roof in under a minute, and by the time the first wall buckled, the dry October air had pulled the smoke north and east, out over the pines, away from town. She watched with her hand resting on the neck of a dog named Soot, a broad-chested mutt the color of old chimney stone, who stood at her knee and watched too, calm as she was calm, and the two of them remained there at the edge of the timber while the cabin she had built with her own hands was returned to ash and cinder on the hillside above Harlan Fork, Wyoming, in the October of 1891. What I want you to understand, before I tell you what came after, is what she did not do. She did not call out. She did not run toward it. She did not weep. At least not in any way that the men watching from the road below could have seen. There were 3 of them down on that road, or 4, she never learned the exact count. She heard the horses blowing in the dark. She heard one voice say a flat single word she would not repeat to anyone, and then the hoofbeats going south toward town. And Ada Crane stood at the tree line, and she thought in a way she had no words for that night, only the feeling of it in her chest that they had burned the wrong house. Because they had. She had not lived in that cabin for going on 8 months. She had been living, through that whole spring and summer, and into the dry autumn, in the house beneath it. And that house, the one they never found, had not so much as smelled the smoke. What she did not yet understand, standing at the tree line with Soot's heat at her side, was how many lives would shelter inside that underground knowledge before the snows came. What she could not have calculated in that first cold hour was the arithmetic of a Wyoming winter that would settle every argument Harlan Fork had ever made about her, and the strange work she had been doing on that hillside. The winter was not yet begun, but it was close, and the sky to the north had a look she had seen before. Not the gray of ordinary cold, but the pewter flat of a sky that has made a decision. If the story of what Ada Crane knew and how she came to know it matters to you, stay close to this one. The world wrote her off once, as it sometimes does with quiet people, and she let it. She had other work to do. Ada had come to Harlan Fork in the spring of 1889 as the wife of a man named Carl, and the marriage had lasted 9 months, which was roughly the length of time it took Carl to understand that the parcel he had purchased from a land agent in Cheyenne was not the bottomland he had been sold in description, but a dry grass bench 500 feet above the Fork's floodplain, with thin soil and a north face that caught every hard wind off the ridge and shed every rain into the drainage below. Carl had not built well against that winter. He had not built well against any of it. By February of 1890 he had made his decision, and by March he had gone south with a freight man's wagon, leaving Ada a promissory note against the quarter section that would pay her approximately $62 if she could find a buyer, which the Harlan Fork assessment agent, a white man named Bert Mast, was happy to confirm she could not, on account of the bench being what the bench was. So she stayed. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go that was closer than her mother's sister in Colorado, and because she had inherited from her father something Carl had not, a winter in the north country of Minnesota, when Ada was 11, in the house her father had built, which was not a house in the conventional reading of the word, but a deliberate shape cut into the face of a hill, banked with sod to the eaves, with only the south-facing wall open to the light and the whole mass of the hillside acting as its insulation. Her father, Nels, had been a quiet man of Norwegian extraction who had learned the principle not from any book, but from his own father's father, who had known from long practice that the earth itself, at a depth of 4 or 5 feet, holds a steady cold season temperature that no blizzard can drive below freezing and no dry wind can strip away. Nels had explained it to Ada not as a theory, but as a fact she could put her hand to. He had taken her on a morning when the outdoor thermometer read 11 degrees below into the dug-root cellar behind the main structure and shown her the thermometer hanging on its nail beside the winter apple bins. 34 degrees, steady. He had said, "The ground does not panic." And that was the whole lesson. Ada had not forgotten it. In the spring of 1890, alone on the bench above Harlan Fork with $62 she could not collect and a quarter section nobody wanted, she began digging. Soot had come with the property, in a manner of speaking. He was a dog without a clear owner who had been living in the timber above the bench and who appeared one morning to watch her work and then sat down and did not leave. She fed him scraps. He slept at the door. By June, he was following her down the row when she cleared the bench grass for planting, and she named him for his color. And that was the whole of his origin story, which suited both of them. She dug on the south face of the hill. She had chosen the spot in late March, when the frost was still in the ground, but the south-facing surface had begun to soften, and she had paced the dimensions out in the frozen grass before. She broke the first crust with the mattock. 6 feet down, 12 feet back into the hill's body. Those were the numbers her father had used in Minnesota, and she saw no reason to change them. The digging took 3 weeks, working in the mornings when the soil was cold and firm enough to hold its cut, resting in the afternoons when the sun softened it and the walls of the excavation wanted to slip. She moved the spoil in a barrow she borrowed from no one, carrying it 20 feet north and spreading it thin over a shallow depression in the bench grass, so the grade of the hill stayed close to what it had been. She felled her first timber on a Thursday in early April, a pole pine 8 inches across at the base that she had marked in February by tying a strip of flour sacking around it. She limbed it with a hatchet, notched it at both ends with a saw, and dragged it to the site with a rope over her own shoulder, because she had no horse yet, and Bert Mast's price for the loan of his mule was higher than she was going to pay. The pole made the central ridgeline of the frame. She cut 6 more in the following weeks and brought them down the hill the same way, one at a time, and Soot trotted behind her each trip as if supervising the pace. The frame she built on the angle her father had taught her, not vertical walls but battered walls, each post set at a 5-degree inward slope so that the earth pressing from outside bore down through the frame rather than against it. Nels had explained the principle by pressing both palms flat against a doorframe and then gradually spreading his feet until the doorframe pushed back. It was the same as a keystone arch, he said, only laid on its side. The ground does not panic, and neither should the frame. Ada had been 11 years old and had understood it the way you understand a thing demonstrated with the body rather than with words, immediately and completely, without being able to say it back until later. She set a south-facing wall of split pine boards, each board dressed smooth on its inner face with the draw knife her father had left her in his tools, the one good thing she had taken from the Crane household when Carl left. The door was pine boards on a pine frame, hung on cast hinges she bought at the Fork Hardware for 30 cents the pair. Above the doorway, she framed a small window, 14 inches by 20, that would catch the winter sun low across the hillside in December and January, when the angle was right, bringing enough light to read by in the middle of the day without burning oil. She filled the wall joints and the junction between the boards and the packed earth with a clay and chaff mixture she made herself in a half barrel, 2 parts creek clay to 1 part dried chaff from the previous autumn's threshing floor at the Fork Mill, worked together with water until the consistency was like cold porridge, then packed with a flat stick and allowed to dry between coats. She did 3 coats. It took a week. When the last coat dried and she ran her thumb along the joint and felt no give, she felt something close to satisfaction. which was a word her father had used carefully and only for things that deserved it. The smoke vent shaft she cut with a long-handled auger, driving it straight up through 8 feet of earth to the surface, and capped it with a tin hood she fashioned from a stovepipe section she had carried up from the Fork Dry Goods for 70 cents. She bent the hood herself over the lip of the half-barrel. It was not elegant. It worked. Above the whole structure, over 8 feet of packed earth and the framework of pole pine ceiling timbers, she planted the bench grass back down in strips she had cut and set aside, and tamped them with the mattock head until the seams were invisible from 30 feet. Then she built the cabin. The cabin was real. It was not a decoy in any calculated sense. She built it because she needed a face to show the world, and because the summer work and the bench's thin soil had given her enough lumber credit at the Forks Mill to raise a small one-room structure with a proper stove and a plank floor. She lived in it through the summer of '90 and into the fall. She planted a kitchen garden on the bench and a small field of winter wheat on the eastern slope, below the frost pocket, where the drainage was better, the way Nels had taught her to read a hillside. She kept to herself. She did not seek the town's opinion, which was fortunate, because it came without being sought. Bert Mast was the first to name it. He had ridden up the track to the bench in late July to confirm, for a buyer he claimed to represent, that the quarter section was still unencumbered. He stood in the yard and looked at the south face of the hill and at the small door set into it and at the raw earth around the frame. And he said, without particular cruelty, simply as a man confirming what he already knew, "That is Ada Crane's hole." He said it to the buyer he had brought, a man named Foss, and Foss looked at it and nodded as if the naming made the thing complete. Ada heard it from the kitchen garden and said nothing. By September, the naming had reached the general store. The proprietor, Hugh Dell, kept a porch where men came on Saturday mornings, and the porch had a settled opinion about the quarter section above Harlan Fork and about the woman on it who was digging herself into a hill like a prairie dog. Ada Crane's hole was how they said it, and the tone was not quite mean and not quite kind. It was the tone of people who are comfortable in their confidence and cannot imagine being wrong. Hugh Dell said it once in her hearing when she came in for flour and a 5-pound tin of lard in October of '90. He said it with a kind of fond contempt, the way a person names a neighbor's eccentric habit, and the two men with him on the porch nodded in the way of people confirming a consensus. Ada set her purchases on the counter and counted her coins and did not look at the porch, and that was the exchange. There was one voice that was different, a woman named Clara Pitts, who had homesteaded the South Slope 3 miles down from the Fork with her husband before he took sick, had ridden up to the bench in August carrying a jar of pickled beets and a frank question. "What are you building down in there?" Ada had told her plainly. Clara had listened. She had asked about the temperature differential and about the clay and chaff mixture in the wall joints, and she had not called it a hole. She had called it sensible, which was the single warmest word Ada heard that year from anyone in Harlan Fork's radius. Clara's voice at the October town meeting carried less weight than it should have. The meeting was called not about Ada directly, which would have required a formal grievance, but about the bench property and what the county's interest in it might be, given that the note against it had not been redeemed. Bert Mast presided. He said the county had an interest in seeing the land put to productive use, and by productive he meant something that would register a taxable improvement by spring. Clara Pitts said the woman on the hill had put in a wheat field and a kitchen garden and built 2 structures, one of which was more solid than half the houses in the valley. Bert Mast said that Ada Crane's hole did not constitute a taxable improvement. There was laughter, not unkind, but not kind either. The vote went 5-2 against the bench, remaining in Ada's name past the spring assessment. Clara Pitts rode up the track the next morning to tell her, "If you have stayed with this story to its middle, you may have begun to understand what the men on that road in October of '91 did not. That the thing they burned was not the most important thing on the hillside. What Ada had spent the winter of '90 to '91 doing, after the town meeting, after the assessment threat, was something closer to deepening than to building. The main chamber she took back another 8 feet into the hill's body, going slowly, one barrow at a time through the frozen weeks of January and February, shoring the extension with fresh pole pine timbers as she cleared the cut. She added a second, smaller chamber off the east wall for fuel and stores, framed separately and connected by a low opening she had to turn sideways to pass through, which she did not mind. The battered angle she carried into every new section without thinking about it. The way you carry a habit you learned young. The 5-degree inward slope at every post. The clay and chaff packed 3 coats deep at every joint. She built a second sleeping platform above the first, a shelf of pine boards at shoulder height against the east wall, and laid it with a straw tick she had sewn herself from feed sacking and filled from the stack behind the cabin. And over the tick she spread 2 quilts her mother had sent from Minnesota when Ada had written the plain letter explaining that Carl was gone and the marriage with him. Her mother had said nothing in the letter she sent back, only packed the quilts, the heavy log cabin pattern ones she had made years before, and Ada had understood this as the fullest kind of answer. She installed a small iron stove in the main chamber, purchased second-hand from the Fork Hardware for $4.80. Its 4 legs set in a shallow clay hearth she built herself to keep the packed earth floor from scorching. The stovepipe she ran up through the existing vent shaft, a tight fit that she sealed at the junction with wet clay packed in with her fingers and left 3 days to cure. When she lit the first fire and the smoke drew clean, and nothing came back into the chamber, she held her hand over the vent opening and felt the draw against her palm and was satisfied. She stocked the fuel chamber with 1.5 cords of split pine, armload by armload from the stack behind the cabin, building it tight against the west wall from packed earth floor to pole pine ceiling. The provisions she assembled across September and October: 50 pounds of dried beans, 30 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried apple from the young trees on the south slope, a sealed tin gallon of lard, a wheel of hard cheese in 2 layers of wax cloth, and 36 jars of her own, putting up from the summer garden, green beans and tomatoes and pickled beets in the clay-sealed jars she had been washing and saving since May. She arranged the jars on pine board shelving pegged to the north wall, and she hung a smoked ham from a hook in the ceiling timber and a braided rope of dried onions beside it. She packed the floor under the sleeping platform with potatoes sorted by size. She had stocked it as her father had stocked the Minnesota house, not for a bad winter, but for the worst one. By the time the cabin burned in October of '91, Ada had moved her sleeping down to the earth house and had been doing so since early September, when the first cold came early off the ridge and the cabin stove was burning 1/2 cord a week against a wind that found every seam in the plank walls. The earth house needed 1 small fire in the morning and 1 in the evening. The temperature in the main chamber at 3 in the morning in a hard frost, when Ada held the candle close to the thermometer she had hung beside the stores, was 37 degrees, sometimes 38. It was not warm in the way a parlor is warm. It was warm in the way the ground is warm. Steady, without apology. Soot slept beside the stove on a folded feed sack and did not seem to find the arrangements unusual. The cabin above, in that last month before it burned, had been mostly empty. She had kept firewood on the hearth and her spinning wheel by the window and a few pots on the hook, in case anyone came up the track. She had not put soot up there at night. She had not slept up there herself, not since the first heavy frost. The men on the road that October night had done what men do when they are frightened by something they cannot categorize, and have been told by the assessor and the porch and the general consensus of the fork that the thing is worthless, and the woman is eccentric, and the whole arrangement will resolve itself come spring anyway. They had resolved it their own way. Ada did not know their names with certainty. She had her suspicions, and she kept them to herself. And what she felt watching the fire was not rage and not grief and not satisfaction. What she felt was the peculiar steadiness of someone who has prepared for a thing and then watches the thing arrive. Soot leaned into her knee. She put her hand on his head, and they stood there together until the fire settled into itself and the smoke went west on a turn of the wind. The winter that year, the winter of 1891 into 92, came down from the north in the last week of November with a severity that the oldest settlers in Harlan Fork said they had not seen in 40 years. The first temperature reading at the Fork General Store, taken by Hugh Dell himself, who kept a log for the county, was 14 below on the morning of the 29th of November. By December 5th, it had not risen above zero in 6 days. By December 12th, the Fork was recording temperatures of 22 below in the mornings, and the wind off the ridge was blowing at a steady 15 miles an hour out of the northwest, which put the felt cold below 40. The snow had come on November the 27th and had not stopped with any conviction since. 18 inches on the flat, more in the drifts, and the drifts were building against every south-facing wall in the valley. The households in Harlan Fork ran on wood heat, almost entirely. A few had coal, hauled up from Rawlins in the fall, but coal was a $3 purchase per hundredweight, and most families had not laid in more than a half-ton. Bert Mast's household had a ton, which he had bought in September when the dealer's price was favorable, and he was burning through it at a pace that concerned him by December's second week. The Dell household above the store had started the season with 4 cords of cut pine, and by December 10th, Hugh Dell's wife had told him privately they were below 2 cords, and the kitchen fire was running all night to keep the pipes clear. Clara Pitts, on the south slope, had half a cord and a root cellar that was holding at 31 degrees, cold enough to keep the potatoes but not much warmer than outside. On December 14th, the temperature at the Fork reading fell to 29 below. Hugh Dell logged it at 6 in the morning and stood at his store window and looked north up the Fork Road and saw a sky the color of ash in every direction and felt the particular dread of a man who is counting cords and coming up short. It was Clara Pitts who went up the track first. She had been thinking about Ada Crane since November, when the cold started in earnest, and she had said nothing to anyone at the Fork because she understood that saying it would invite the porch opinion, and the porch was in no mood for admissions. She harnessed her horse on the morning of December the 15th, in 26 below, wrapped herself in every wool she owned, a heavy shawl over her coat and her husband's old canvas over the shawl, and rode the 3 miles up to the bench with her breath coming in short white clouds, and the horse's hooves squeaking against the packed snow road, the way hooves squeak only in the worst cold. The cabin was a black scar on the hillside. That was the first thing she saw when she came around the last bend, the low rectangle of charred timber, half buried in snow, the walls fallen in on themselves, the whole shape reduced and flattened and already half covered by the drifts that had come since October. It looked like something that had been there a long time. She reined the horse and looked at it for a moment, and she felt the thing she had half expected and half feared, that she had come too late, that the cold had found Ada before she did. The second thing she saw was Soot, standing on the path below the ruin, watching her come. He did not bark. He stood with his dark head up and his tail low, patient as a person, and when Clara was close enough, he turned and walked down the south face of the hill toward a door she had not seen from the track. A small timber-frame door set into the hill's body just above the frost line, with a tin-hooded vent shaft rising 8 feet above it, and a thin thread of pale smoke moving from the vent into the still air. Ada opened the door before Clara knocked. She had heard the horse for the last quarter-mile, the sound carrying clean in the frozen air. The warmth that came out of the open doorway was not dramatic. It was not a blast of hot air, nothing like standing beside a roaring stove. It was the warmth of a room that had been held at a steady temperature through weeks of hard cold, by 8 feet of earth on 5 sides and a ceiling of pole pine timber packed thick above, by a small iron stove burning one piece of split pine at a measured time, by the principle that a structure built to accept the earth's stability rather than fight it will hold what you give it. It was warmth without argument, warmth that did not need to announce itself. It was the warmth of Nels Halverson's lesson, completed across 30 years and 1,500 miles from the root cellar where he had held a candle up to a thermometer reading 34 degrees on a morning when the outside air was 11 below zero. Clara Pitts stepped inside. She stood for a moment with the low door frame above her head and the packed earth floor beneath her feet, and the smell of the place around her, which was the smell of pine smoke and dried apple and clay earth, and the particular warmth that is not fire warmth, but the warmth of a thing that has been patient. Soot came in behind her and curled on his feed sack beside the stove, his dark coat catching the light from the single tallow candle on the shelf. Ada said, "Sit down," and Clara sat at the small table Ada had built from 2 pine boards and a pair of sawhorses. Ada poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the stove's flat surface all morning, hot without boiling, and Clara held the cup in both hands and looked around at the shelving with its rows of jars, at the stacked firewood visible through the opening of the fuel chamber, at the sleeping platform with its quilts folded flat, at the thermometer on its nail beside the stores. Ada watched her look at it. Clara read the number. Her lips moved. She said after a time, "How long has it been this warm?" Ada said, "Since I built it. The ground does not panic." Clara sat with that for a moment. She set the cup down on the pine board table and looked at her own hands, which had been cold since November, in a way that did not leave even inside by a fire. She looked at them inside Ada's earth house, and they were warm. She said, "People are going to lose fingers. Maybe worse." Ada said nothing because it was not a question. She poured her own coffee and sat down across the table, and they sat together in the warmth that the earth had kept, while outside the bench above Harlan Fork held at 26 below, and the sky to the north showed no sign of relenting. By December the 17th, there were 7 people in the earth house. Clara Pitts had gone back down to the fork and come back with her 2 youngest boys, 13 and 11, and she had told Hugh Dell and he had told Bert Mast, and the conversation on the porch of the general store in 24 below was of a different character than the conversations of the preceding year. Hugh Dell rode up on the afternoon of the 17th with his wife and their youngest daughter and a sack of provisions, because the store's pipes had frozen and the upstairs was running on the last of the kitchen coal. Bert Mast came the following morning, alone, his horse blowing steam in the cold, and he stood for a long moment outside the door before he knocked. Ada opened it. He stepped inside. He was a man accustomed to taking the measure of a room, of an arrangement, of a dollar's worth of improvement, and he took the measure of this one. He looked at the banked walls and the pole pine ceiling and the stacked firewood through the opening of the fuel chamber and the rows of jars on the shelving Ada had fixed to the east wall and the thermometer on its nail beside the stores. He looked at soot, asleep on the feed sack. He looked at the 7 people in various postures of rest and warmth. Clara Pitts with her boys. Hugh Dell's wife at the small table with her hands around a bowl. Then he looked at Ada. She did not look away. She had the kettle in her hand, on its way back to the stove, and she held his gaze the way a person holds a door open, neither inviting nor refusing. Bert Mast looked at the thermometer. It read 39 degrees. Outside, on the bench above Harlan Fork, Wyoming, on the morning of December 18th, 1891, the reading at the general store log was 31 below zero. He said quietly, almost to himself, "I didn't know it would hold that temperature." Ada set the kettle back on the stove. She said nothing. She did not need to. By December 20th, there were 14 people sheltering in the earth house and the widened main chamber that Ada had opened up through the east wall. 3 more came on the 22nd, including Foss, who had ridden up from the Fork Road with his wife wrapped in a horse blanket and his hands nearly gone with cold inside his gloves. And Ada had brought him inside and sat him by the stove and worked his hands herself. And she did not look at him with anything other than attention to the task, because that was what the moment required. The hard cold held through December 27th. On that morning, Hugo Dell's log at the Fork read 8 below, which felt, he wrote, like a thaw. The following day, the temperature climbed to 2 above and the wind quit, and people began the careful work of returning to their homes to find what the cold had taken and what it held. What the cold had taken was not trivial. 4 households in the Fork's radius had lost pipes entirely, and 1 had lost a wall section where the frost had cracked the mortar. 2 men who had stayed in their own houses through the worst of it lost sections of frost from fingers, and 1 lost 3 toes on the right foot. No lives were lost, which the Fork attributed variously to Providence, to good sense, and over the next several weeks, with increasing specificity, to Ada Crane's hole. They stopped calling it a hole somewhere in the late spring of 1892. A man from the county land office named Stiles came up to the bench in April with a measuring rod and a notebook and spent 2 days recording the structure's dimensions and its principle of construction and writing it up in a formal report that he sent to the Territory Land Commission in Cheyenne. He called it, in the report, a banked earth shelter of the Halverson pattern, which was the name he derived from what Ada told him about her father, and the name stuck in the formal record, though the Fork simply called it Ada's house, which was more accurate and warmer in tone. The assessment notice against the quarter section was withdrawn. The land was confirmed in Ada's name. Clara Pitts had 3 neighbors build earth shelters on the south-facing slopes of their own homesteads in the summer of '92, watching Ada work when she expanded the east chamber, and asking questions she answered plainly. She taught the battered wall principle by pressing her palms against a doorframe and spreading her feet, the way Nels had taught her, and Clara's neighbor Tom watched and then watched again and said, "It pushes back." Ada said, "Yes." He did not take full notes, and the shelter he built that summer leaked at the wall joints because he used sand mortar instead of clay and chaff, and the second winter cracked 3 of his joints, and he had to pull the east wall and repack it. The copying of the form without the principle was the one failure the method suffered, and Ada was patient about explaining the difference between the 2. The principle was not the battered angle or the clay and chaff, not as such. The principle was what her father had said in the Minnesota root cellar with the thermometer reading 34 degrees. The ground does not panic. The principle was that mass, given time, resists change, and that a structure built to invite the ground's stability rather than fight it will hold what you put inside it, whether the thing inside is apples or warmth or a life. She wrote that down in those words in a letter to Clara in the winter of '93, because Clara had asked her to put it plain. Soot lived to be 11, which was old for a dog of his size and constitution. He was on the feed sack beside the small iron stove when he died, in the winter of 1902, with his head on Ada's knee, and she buried him on the south face of the hill above the earth house door, in a spot that caught the morning sun, which was what he had always preferred. She was 53 years old by then, and the bench was a different place from the bare, dry grass shelf that Carl had abandoned. She had planted a windbreak of lodgepole pines along the north ridge, 37 trees set in 2 offset rows that cut the worst of the northwest wind and had, in the course of 12 years, grown to a living wall 40 feet high and the width of a parlor. Below the windbreak she had put in apple trees, 6 of them, and the apples were coming in reliable now, yellow and small and tart, good for keeping. The wheat field on the eastern slope had become permanent. The earth house had been extended twice, once in 94 and once in 98, adding a second fuel chamber and a small separate root cellar with a clay-lined floor that kept the winter apples at exactly the temperature she needed. The Halverson pattern, as Stiles had called it, had gone into at least 30 homesteads in the territory by 1900, by Clara's informal count. Some were well-built and some were poorly built, and the difference, Clara wrote in a letter to her daughter years later, was almost always the same. The ones who had understood the principle could explain it, and the ones who had only copied the shape could not. Ada had said it plain enough. The ground does not panic, and what she had not said, but what Clara came to understand in her own time, was that the builder who truly grasped it was also, in some basic sense, less likely to panic, because they had learned what the earth knows, that mass and patience and the willingness to be still inside a hard winter are not weakness. They are the method. They are what holds. The burned scar above the door healed over in 3 or 4 seasons. The grass came back, and the soil that Ada had tamped down over the earth house roof grew thick and deep enough by 95 that she planted a kitchen garden directly above the main chamber. And in the summer months she could stand on top of the house she lived in and turn the soil and not feel anything beneath her feet but the steady, unhurried warmth of the ground. She lived on the bench above Harlan Fork until 1899, when Clara Pitts' eldest son, who had sheltered in the earth house as a 13-year-old boy in the hard winter and who had grown into a surveyor, helped her file a homestead addition that gave her the timber rights to the hillside above. She sold the quarter section itself in 1903, when she was 54, for $920 to a man named Orens, who wanted the eastern slope for barley, and she moved to Rawlins, where she spent the next 11 years writing down what her father had taught her and what she had learned in the doing of it, in a series of plain notebooks that Clara's family kept after Ada died in 1914, and that eventually found their way into the Territory Archive in Cheyenne. The notebooks are there still. They are not dramatic documents. They are the record of a woman working out what she knows in the plain language of someone who learned things with her hands before she could name them with words. There are drawings in the margins, elevation sketches of battered walls, cross-sections of earth berms, a diagram of the clay and chaff mixture with the ratio written out in her careful round hand. There are temperature records from 30 winters, the thermometer readings she kept beside the stores, column after column of figures that tell, if you read them the right way, the story of a woman who found the warmth inside a hillside and learned to live inside it without asking the world's permission. The earth house itself stood on the bench above Harlan Fork until 1931, when a grandson of Hugh Dells bought the property and found the structure still intact under 40 years of grass and weathering. The battered walls still sound, the clay and chaff joints still sealed. He was told what it was by an old woman in town who remembered the winter of '91, and he wrote a letter to the Cheyenne paper about it, which is how most of what I have told you found its way into the record. He said in the letter that he had opened the door on a January morning and stepped inside, and the temperature inside was 36 degrees. Outside that morning it was 19 below. The ground, he said, did not seem to know that anyone had stopped tending it. It did not panic. It simply held.